PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors of books about Pennsylvanian history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with author Allen Guelzo about his book, Voices from Gettysburg.
This week on PA Books, Allen Guelzo, author of Voices from Gettysburg.
Allen Guelzo is the author of Voices from Gettysburg. Now, you say in the book that you've been a Civil War person ever since your boyhood. What happened in your boyhood that really drew you to the Civil War?
Comic books, believe it or not. When I was very small, out on the West Coast, Monterey, California, my father was at the Defense Language Institute there in Monterey. And living in the town, we, of course, were part of the town's activities, and that meant going shopping in the local supermarket. And in that local supermarket, there was a section set aside for magazines and things like that, and of course, comic books. And right there, snagging my eye, was a comic book version of The Red Badge of Courage. And in the most dramatic cover, you could see Henry Fleming running away from a Confederate battle line, waving a Confederate flag. And so the story of the Red Badge of Courage was really something of the beginning for me. And then in addition to that, within the covers of the same comic book, there was an insert which gave a 16-page comic book history of the Civil War. I can't give you an exact date when that happened. I would guess perhaps 1958, 59, but that's where it all began for me with the Civil War.
Do you remember the first Civil War battlefield you visited?
Actually, surprisingly enough, the first Civil War battlefield I ever visited was Gettysburg. And that was comparatively late. That was 1975, the spring of 1975. And that was largely because I was tagging along with a class field trip. I was a research assistant for a professor. And I went along with him to Gettysburg on this field trip, walked out on the overlook of the old visitor center at Gettysburg, looked around, and suddenly it was like, I know everything. It's like I've been here before. There's Little Round Top. There's the Angle. There's Seminary Ridge. Well, I had read about these things, and reading about them had lodged them in my mind, but actually walking out and seeing them and knowing them, it was like love at first sight.
What is it that you think what is it about Gettysburg, the battlefield, that seems to draw people in a way that some of the other battlefields don't?
Well, for one thing, Gettysburg is beautifully kept, and it's easily accessible. Another thing is that so much of the battle itself can be seen almost in its entirety from just a few vantage points on the battlefield itself. If I have to pick out a favorite one, it's the little knob that forms the corner known as the Peach Orchard. And standing on that particular little knob at the Peach Orchard, you really can see just about 90% of everything that happened at the Battle of Gettysburg. And that, I think, is another thing which attracts people. You can take in the battle from certain vantage points and really, really see the whole business. And then I suppose the third thing is that so much of the Gettysburg battlefield itself and the Gettysburg area has not changed hugely from its appearance in 1863. Gettysburg is a larger town than it was in 1863, of course, and has spread out somewhat. Nevertheless, you can still very easily leave the precincts of the town of Gettysburg and find yourself in countryside, in a rural environment, in farms that look like 1863 only happened yesterday. And I think that's a major part of the charm of Gettysburg.
Now, Gettysburg as a battle and even the actual physical site itself, is a place that lives in our memories and lives in the public imagination in a certain way. And certainly there are a lot of debates over the battle and how it should be interpreted. Why do you think that there are continuing to be conflicts over how we should interpret the battle?
Well, for one thing, the battle was an immensely important affair. In the early months of 1863, the Union cause really looked like it was headed for the breakers. There had been repeated defeats suffered by the Army of the Potomac at places like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. The Army's most well-loved general, George Brinton McClellan, had been dismissed by Lincoln in November of 1862. Out in the West, the campaign that Ulysses Grant was mounting against Vicksburg had been going on since December of 1862, and it really didn't seem to have accomplished a whole lot. He had made one attempt after another at surrounding and laying siege to Vicksburg, and many of those attempts had failed. Well, by the summer of 1863, Grant had successfully put a siege in place, but even then, that takes time, and civilian patience tends to be a whole lot shorter than military time. Things looked exceptionally bad from a military point of view for the Union cause. Politically speaking, it wasn't good either. Abraham Lincoln had issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, and as he himself admitted, almost from the start, large numbers of people in the North disliked it. And then, of course, in November of 1862 comes the congressional elections, and his party gets shellacked in those elections, and largely because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, he issues the proclamation officially and finally on January 1st, 1863, but even so, there were large swathes of opinion in the North which thought that this was a big mistake and were prepared to be pretty vocal in their criticism and their resistance. So much so that by the spring of 1863, you had two key northern states, New York and New Jersey, come into the hands of Democratic governors, anti-Lincoln governors. In 1863, Pennsylvania and Ohio would be electing governors. And if the elections went the same way with Pennsylvania and Ohio, you'd have the central core of the northern states in the hands of people hostile to the Lincoln administration. And they could very readily fold their arms and say, we're not going to cooperate with the war any further. We want the national administration to go to the negotiating table with the Confederacy. And if that happened, that would have been an end to the war. It would have been the independence of the Confederacy. So when Lee launches his invasion in June of 1863, up through the Shenandoah Valley, across the Potomac, and then into Pennsylvania, it was a particularly critical and dire moment for the Union. And the victory that is won there at Gettysburg after 3 days of fighting is almost like a second wind to the Union cause. And it's a wind which will take that cause finally straight through to victory at Appomattox Courthouse in the spring of 1865.
Was Robert E. Lee and the Confederate leadership, were they aware of these political dynamics in the North, and did it shape their decision-making?
Certainly it did for Lee. Lee had a very clear sense that financially, industrially, in terms of logistics, the Confederacy was not on the same par as the North. The North had tremendous resources in terms of people, in terms of industry. Lee understood that. He'd served a great deal of his pre-war Army career in the North. He knew that if the Confederacy was to achieve its independence, it was going to have to play to the war weariness of the Northern public. And the way to make the Northern public weary of the war was to invade, to carry the war into Northern soil, to demonstrate in the most dramatic way imaginable that the Lincoln administration could not win this war, could not even, in fact, prevent a Confederate army from rampaging across the Potomac into the northern states. At that point, Northerners would simply vote to end the war. Northerners would call upon Lincoln to stop this useless sacrifice. And Lee is very conscious of this. Lee describes this as early as 1862 as a strategy. And in 1863, he makes it very explicit. We are going to appeal to the peace element in the North. And one way to appeal to that is to make it clear that by invading Pennsylvania, the Lincoln administration is bankrupt.
Now, you talked about anti-Lincoln Democrats getting into the governorships in a couple of key states, New York and New Jersey, and possibly in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Now, part of the context of this is that Union troops were often raised at the state level before going into federal service. Can you describe how that process worked and why that was significant for having governorships?
The Union Army was largely an army of volunteers. Now, when I use the term volunteers, we tend to think, well, that's just people who step forward and say, yes, I want to be part of this. Actually, it's a technical term with a capital V, so to speak. The United States Army was composed at the outset of the Civil War of what we could call two components. One is the regular army. That's what we would call the United States Army, but it was very small. It was only a little bit more than 16,000. It wasn't much more than a national constabulary. You could almost think of it as being the American equivalent of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And it served little garrisons at forts along the coastal lines, and it provided some peacekeeping measures on the western frontier. But apart from that, it was not a huge or effective fighting force. Then there were the state militias. In theory, every state had a militia system that it was prepared to put at the disposal of the federal government. Well, that was theory. In practice, New York had a very good militia system, very well organized, very large. Vermont hadn't had a militia muster since 1830. So it just wandered all over the map in terms of preparedness. So what was Congress going to do? Congress is a very penny pinching entity in these days. So what Congress does is to authorize the raising of this not quite one, not quite the other entity called the volunteers. Volunteers are raised by the states, by regiments that have state identities, like 72nd Pennsylvania, 14th Brooklyn, in this case, a New York regiment, 8th Ohio. And they would carry a state flag and the national flag. But at the same time, they were then mustered into federal service for 3 years, and they'd be paid and uniformed and equipped by the federal government. So the volunteers were this kind of mixing of categories. But it also meant that since they were, after all, state volunteers, that meant that if a particular state decided that it did not want to cooperate with the Lincoln administration, it could create a substantial amount of trouble by, for instance, insisting that it was going to recall its volunteers from active service with the Union Army. That posed a dramatic and difficult problem.
Now, if as Robert E. Lee is thinking about his plan, is he writing letters and documenting his ideas with the Confederate leadership? Your book includes letters and papers and memoirs. How much documentary evidence is there of his planning?
Well, Lee makes this very explicit in letters that he writes to Jefferson Davis. And he makes it clear to Davis, the best way to move towards Confederate independence is to convince the Northern public, not necessarily to win a military victory over a Northern army, but to convince the Northern public that continued prosecution of this war is going nowhere. It's costing money, it's costing lives, it's exhausting the country. And the only reason that it's being carried on as far as it is because there's a bunch of raving fanatics at the head of the federal government in Washington, chief among whom is Abraham Lincoln. Lee is not shy about the appeal he believes his invasion is going to make to those peace elements. And he really believes that that is going to be an important part of Confederate success. Not so much that the Confederacy is going to fight its way to independence. Confederacy is going to fight just enough to make the North reluctant to keep on fighting. And that will secure Confederate independence, in Lee's mind, just as securely as any Waterloo, as any Battle of Blenheim, as any great strategic military victory.
Now, James Longstreet was also writing about his views about what should happen next for the Confederates. And he had a plan to send troops to help relieve the siege at Vicksburg. How did he fit into this picture, and was he a significant figure in these debates?
This is one of the most interesting questions you're going to ask about Gettysburg, and that concerns Longstreet's role. In the years after Gettysburg, Longstreet does a great deal of talking and writing about his Civil War activities. Some of this takes the form of articles which he publishes in the Philadelphia Weekly Times. Some of it will be reserved for a great memoir that he writes, From Manassas to Appomattox. In it, Longstreet describes himself in ways that people have questioned. He describes himself, for one thing, as being a dissenter of sorts from this plan to invade Pennsylvania. He speaks of himself as favoring instead peeling off elements of Lee's army and sending them west to rescue Vicksburg. Sometimes this had an element of self-promotion to it. For one thing, James Longstreet knew, appreciated, and admired Joe Johnston, who was the overall Confederate commander in the West. But Longstreet may also have envisioned a separate role for himself in this, and there's a certain amount of self-promotion that goes into Longstreet's description of things. Longstreet, in fact, comes up with a plan that he wants to present to Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon. And this has Longstreet taking charge of a considerable portion of the Army of Northern Virginia and taking it to the west and staging some kind of demonstration or distraction that will shake loose Grant's hold on Vicksburg. Did Longstreet really go that far? Was he that explicit? We can't really be sure because there's not a lot of confirmation apart from Longstreet's post-war claims. The same thing, I think, is true for a lot of other things Longstreet says about his behavior and performance in the Gettysburg campaign. He'll insist that he extracted a promise from Lee not to fight an offensive battle. If there was going to be a battle fought in Pennsylvania, the Confederate Army should stand on the defensive, and Longstreet believed that Lee had promised he would do that, only, of course, to have Lee break the promise at Gettysburg, which allows Longstreet to back off and say, if only Lee had listened to me, then things might have turned out different. Again, are we hearing the voice of actual description, or are we hearing the voice of post-war self-promotion? That is a difficult call to make. There are people who are great fans of Longstreet, and they work very hard at trying to help us to understand James Longstreet's importance as one of Lee's core commanders, as a man whom Lee himself called his old war horse. At the same time, Longstreet has also had quite a component of severe critics, among whom were sometimes some of his subordinates. And there have been people who have insisted that you cannot believe a word that James Longstreet writes about his activities. He is such a self-promoter. Trying to situate Longstreet along that spectrum is difficult for a historian. We don't get to interview James Longstreet ourselves and take our measure of him. My own view of Longstreet is that Longstreet probably exaggerated in his post-war writings some degree of his foresight and insight and correct views that should have been followed. I don't think they're entirely off the mark, but I do think he tended to put himself in a position where he looked wiser than Robert E. Lee. And I am not entirely sure that that is really the case.
Now, on the Union side was George Meade, who would take command of the Army of the Potomac abruptly. Said he only a few days before the battle itself. How did he find himself in that situation?
Unhappily. Unhappily, I think basically for two reasons. One is that George Gordon Meade was a Philadelphian. He was also, in that respect, like George McClellan, another Philadelphian, a Democrat. He is someone who is at some arm's length from Lincoln and Lincoln's Republicans and Lincoln's administration. And even from the very beginning of the war, there is a certain element of mistrust among the Republican political leadership of Meade's political loyalties. That, in fact, slows down Meade's commission as a brigadier general at the very outset of the war, because there are radical Republicans who don't entirely trust him. Meade sees himself in the early portion of the war as being very much a follower, an admirer of George McClellan. He has some criticisms to make of McClellan every now and again, but then again, George Meade had criticisms of almost everyone at some point. But he was, by and large, a member of that part of the Army of the Potomac that did not have entirely and unqualified confidence in the leadership of the Lincoln administration. So to be put into command of Lincoln's principal army puts Meade in a very tight situation, because now he has to take direct orders from Lincoln as commander-in-chief, orders he might not, in fact, entirely agree with. And it also means that he's going to be directly responsible. Lincoln is going to hold him directly responsible for the activities and the performance of the Army of the Potomac. Is that the relationship that Meade really wants to be in with Lincoln? That's a tough call to make. But the other thing, and I think a more important factor, was that Meade was put into command of the Army of the Potomac really only 3 days before the beginning of the battle. In other words, Meade is put in charge of the Army of the Potomac with no chance to create his own staff for administering the Army. He has to take on the staff that served Joe Hooker, his predecessor, and Hooker's staff was not entirely charmed to the prospect of working with George Meade. Then he's also got to find himself in the position of giving orders as commander of the Army of the Potomac to the other corps commanders of the Army of the Potomac, who only a few days before, he'd been their peer, their equal. Now suddenly he's giving them orders. And you can easily imagine what happens in a situation like that. Someone who a few days before looked upon George Meade as his equal and his buddy, now is almost a little uncertain. Who do you think you are, giving orders like this? And even if that doesn't happen explicitly, Meade certainly has to take that into account. So Meade finds himself in this position. It's not he volunteered for it. He is ordered to take command of the Army of the Potomac. No surprise that Meade's first instinct is caution. He's a cautious person, just to start with, but his first instinct is caution. Lee's army has moved up into Pennsylvania. All right, let's create some kind of defensive position that will protect key cities like Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia. Let's create a defensive position on the heights overlooking Pipe Creek in western Maryland. And if we do that, if we protect Baltimore and Washington and places like that, all right, that's a good beginning until George Meade can figure out what should be done next. That's Meade's first instinct. And as it turns out, he doesn't get to follow it.
Now, one of his subordinates, Reynolds, has a difference of opinion about how aggressive to be. What were his ideas?
John Reynolds is, in some cases, an illustration of what I meant by Meade having this difficult position in which he has to give orders to people who a few days before he didn't give orders to. John Fulton Reynolds was a Pennsylvanian, like Meade, but he came from central Pennsylvania. He came from Lancaster. And as such, he had a pretty clear view of what life in central Pennsylvania was like, what the needs of central Pennsylvania were, and how vulnerable it was. In fact, in 1862, during the Antietam campaign, Reynolds had actually been specially detailed to Pennsylvania to take charge of the Pennsylvania militia that was being mobilized for service during the Antietam campaign. They don't actually see action, but nevertheless, it gives another opportunity for Reynolds to take the estimate of what Pennsylvania can absorb. When Lee moves up into Pennsylvania, Reynolds is in charge of one wing of the Army of the Potomac. It's a wing that includes his own 1st Infantry Corps, plus the 3rd Corps of Dan Sickles, and then the 11th Corps, commanded by Oliver Otis Howard. Reynolds is determined to move up into Pennsylvania following Lee as closely as he can. He is not friendly to the notion that we're going to draw back and create a defensive position behind Pipe Creek. He does not want to see Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia rampaging across south central Pennsylvania. So Reynolds, in the absence of any direct orders from Meade at that point, pushes his wing pretty aggressively forward, pushes them right up through Maryland, right up to the Pennsylvania border, just only 7 miles south of Gettysburg. And he is ready to do something unless George Meade will issue an order expressly telling him that he must pull back to Pipe Creek. In the absence of such an order at that point, on June 30th, 1863, Reynolds is prepared to commit himself to the occupation of Gettysburg and to stymie any effort by Robert E. Lee to do any kind of destruction in central Pennsylvania.
So while these events are going on in the Union Army, what is Lee's troops doing?
Lee has moved up from his original position behind the Rappahannock River in early June 1863, peeling off the 3 infantry corps of his army one by one and sending them into the Shenandoah Valley, down the Shenandoah Valley to the Potomac River, and across the Potomac up through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. He sends one of these 3 corps under Richard Stoddard Ewell in a long arc that bends northwards towards Harrisburg, the Pennsylvania state capital, on the Susquehanna River. Another infantry corps is pushed eastwards across South Mountain through the Cashtown Gap, headed toward Gettysburg. And of course, it's going to head toward Gettysburg because Gettysburg is probably the most important crossroads town in south central Pennsylvania. If you're going to go anywhere eastward from South Mountain, you're going to go through Gettysburg sooner or later. Behind A.P. Hill's corps would come the infantry corps commanded by James Longstreet. Generally speaking, the idea that Lee had was that the Union Army was going to exhaust itself chasing after him into Pennsylvania. At that point, when he had a clear view of where the Union Army was and what it was going to be doing, he was going to pull those 3 infantry corps of the Army of Northern Virginia together, concentrate them at Gettysburg, and then defeat the Army of the Potomac as it comes huffing and puffing, rushing, exhausted, disunited, up the roads. He's going to beat them piece by piece as they come up. And when he's done that, he's not only achieved that preliminary goal of tearing up Northern political morale, he will have actually beaten a Union army on Northern territory. Imagine the impact that would have on Northern voters and Northern public opinion. And it almost works. It almost works. He does concentrate the Army of Northern Virginia at Gettysburg. He orders Ewell's corps. Once he discovers where the Union Army is and that George Meade is now in charge of it, he orders Ewell's corps down to Gettysburg, wants to concentrate Hill there, wants to bring Longstreet over South Mountain. He's going to be ready. There was only one thing wrong. He was about 24 hours too late because John Reynolds had already moved the lead elements of his wing up to Gettysburg itself. In this case, the point of his spear being 2 brigades of Union cavalry under the command of John Buford.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
How much do these 2 armies know about each other's movements?
They actually know a substantial amount. Robert E. Lee had part of his cavalry force under Jeb Stuart galloping off on a great joyride around the Union Army and out of effective connection with his own troops. Stuart doesn't rejoin Lee until the evening of July 2nd. And many people afterwards, in fact, almost immediately afterwards, blamed the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg on Stuart. And they said, Jeb Stuart is supposed to be the eyes of the army as its cavalry. Well, here he gallops off and deprives Lee, and Lee is feeling around blindly in Pennsylvania. So no wonder there's an encounter where Lee does not, in fact, have things end well for him. I think that's an exaggeration. I think, for one thing, it's a mistake of what cavalry does in the Civil War. Cavalry are not spies. They wear uniforms. No one's going to be letting them have a look at what the Union Army is doing without some kind of obstruction. What the cavalry of the Army of Northern Virginia do is not helpful to Lee, but it's also true that Lee still had 3 brigades of cavalry at his disposal that he could have used if information gathering was the most important thing. In fact, Lee had a fairly good idea of where the Union Army was. And it was information that did come directly from scouts and from spies, people who infiltrated the Union camps in civilian dress and invited people to have a drink that would loosen their lips and tell them what tomorrow's plans were. He had that, and he also, believe it or not, had a great friend, an unintentional friend, in Northern newspapers. To the despair of George Meade and many other Union officers, Northern journalists who were traveling with the Army of the Potomac seemed to have no hesitation about writing dispatches for their newspapers that said exactly where they were located and where they were going. Lee very diligently read Northern newspapers, and the Northern newspapers provided him with a lot of the information that he needed. Some of the same thing was true for the Union Army as well. And what you find with Lee is Lee actually has a good working understanding of where the Union Army is. What he didn't have, and in the 19th century probably couldn't have had precisely, was a pinpoint notion of where the Union Army was. That's what John Reynolds takes advantage of. John Reynolds gets to Gettysburg a day ahead of where Lee would have wanted things to have happened. And he is prepared to hold on to the town of Gettysburg, not only as tenaciously as he can, but to hold on to it in such a way as it will basically force the hand of his commanding officer, George Meade, to come to the rescue of Gettysburg, not to stay behind at Pipe Creek. In a sense, John Reynolds forces George Meade to fight the Battle of Gettysburg at Gettysburg.
Now, one of the things that Confederate troops were doing when they came into Pennsylvania was they were kidnapping African Americans there to take back to Virginia and to enslave them. You have an excerpt from a writing from a Philip Schaff about his eyewitness accounts of this. Who is he, and what did he write about?
Philip Schaff was a Swiss-born theologian and church historian. In fact, one of the most talented and influential church historians of the 19th century. Schaff's writings are still read with some degree of authority, even today, by students of the history of Christianity. He was in Pennsylvania, not in Switzerland. He was in Pennsylvania because he had been hired by the German Reformed Theological Seminary at Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, to teach church history there. And that's what he was doing in the town of Mercersburg when the great Confederate sweep northwards into central Pennsylvania sweeps over the town of Mercersburg. What Schaff witnesses is something which, in years after the battle and after the war, apologists for the Confederacy tried to pretend hadn't happened. One of the long-lived stories about the Gettysburg campaign is that at the very outset, Robert E. Lee issues stringent orders to his soldiers that they may not forage, steal, pick up, and walk away with Union property. And this is supposed to demonstrate what a noble, honest, and chivalrous host the Confederate Army was, as opposed to that nasty grab everything that isn't nailed down the Army of the Potomac, or worse still, William Tecumseh Sherman burning everything in his path through Georgia. Well, I hope I can say it here once and for all, but for one thing, William Tecumseh Sherman did not burn his way all the way through Georgia. I think we need to set that aside, but all right, that's a different book. The Union Army, yes, behaved like armies behave in every time and in every place from the time of Alexander the Great to today. So did the Confederate Army. Because despite Lee's official order forbidding this sort of thing, armies are armies. And the Confederate Army moves up into Pennsylvania, and just like its Union counterparts, if it wasn't nailed down, and probably in some cases, even if it was, the Confederate Army was going to appropriate it. One species of property that the Union Army didn't appropriate when it was in Southern territory, but which the Confederate Army did when it was in the North, was human beings. And that is any black people whom the Army of Northern Virginia could lay its hands upon in South Central Pennsylvania would be rounded up like so many slaves that had been kidnapped from the shores of Western Africa. And they would be bound and tied up and sent southwards to be sold as slaves in the slave marts at Richmond. It didn't matter that these might have been families of free black people from time out of mind for generations. No, that made no difference whatsoever. There was money to be made in the sale of slaves, and so slaves they will become. The estimates peg the number of black people who are kidnapped by the Confederate Army and sold. Usually comes in somewhere between 300 and 500. And I have to say, too, it wasn't just on this occasion in Pennsylvania. The same thing had happened in the Antietam campaign. This was a regular trade in human beings. And the Confederate Army indulges it. It indulges it in terms of kidnapping black people. It indulges other kinds of mayhem. In the town of Gettysburg, on the first day of the battle, Confederate soldiers were even noticed stealing laundry off the laundry lines in the back lots of Gettysburg, the townhouses. They were behaving that way because, as I say, armies have always behaved that way. These are people with guns in their hands. And they use the force that they're able to deploy to get what they want. And in the case of the Army of Northern Virginia, they want slaves, and they get them.
Well, let's go back to John Buford. He's in Gettysburg early. The sun rises on July 1st. Where are his troops, and what situation is he in?
Actually, the sun doesn't rise terribly well on July 1st. We often think about Gettysburg as being fought under dazzlingly blue skies. Not July 1st. July 1st, it's raining. In fact, it had rained cats and dogs through most of the month of June. It was a very wet summer. July 1st opens with mist, light rain. The rain tends to taper off by around 7:30, but it's going to be a misty, overcast day. So that's one picture of a background you have to get for the opening of the Battle of Gettysburg, and keep that in view. What happens early in the morning of July 1st is that A.P. Hill's Corps, which is supposed to move into Gettysburg as part of Lee's concentration there, as it moves towards Gettysburg, some 3 miles west of the town of Gettysburg, on a ridgeline called Knoxland Ridge, the Confederate infantry marching along the road there, the old Chambersburg Pike, encounters Federal cavalry. There are Federal cavalry outposts which have been placed there the evening before by their commanding officer, John Buford. These outposts see the Confederate infantry advancing up the road, and one cavalry officer, Marcellus Jones, borrows the carbine of one of his sergeants, steadies it on a fence rail, and fires the first shot of the Battle of Gettysburg. There's not much in the way of cavalry. There are only 2 brigades, and A.P. Hill has got a whole lot more infantry plus artillery at his disposal. And what A.P. Hill does is to deploy his infantry into line of battle, and they go forward. And what do Buford's cavalrymen do? They say, okay. They mount up and they gallop off to the next ridge line further towards Gettysburg. Then the Confederate infantry has to get back into line of march, back on the road, march down to the next ridgeline where there are more Federal cavalrymen, and they have to stop because they don't know what might be behind this Federal cavalry. Maybe nothing, Maybe just Pennsylvania militia? Maybe the Army of the Potomac. Do they want to take a chance that way? So they have to deploy in a line of battle again. They move forward, and Federal cavalrymen say, goodbye, mount up, gallop to the next ridge. What this process does, since it takes for a whole brigade of infantry something like 45 minutes to get in and out of line, what this does, it slows down the advance of the Confederates toward Gettysburg. And finally, it's not until nearly 10 o'clock that the lead elements of A.P. Hill's Corps are actually getting down to the last ridge line, McPherson's Ridge, before they will mount Seminary Ridge and actually be able to look and see the town of Gettysburg. So Buford's doing a classic delaying tactic. Why? Because he knows that John Reynolds and the infantry of Reynolds's First Corps is coming up the roads from Maryland. He's trying to buy time for them to get up to Gettysburg and lay out a defense for the town of Gettysburg and really stop these Confederates in their tracks. And he just barely succeeds. It is just at the moment when Confederate infantry is moving within sight of Buford's observation post in the cupola of the Lutheran Theological Seminary on Seminary Ridge. Buford can see them coming. Buford looks back down southwards along the road lines, leading to where Reynolds is supposed to be. And at that moment, this is almost too dramatic. You think this might have been done as a script. Up the road comes galloping John Reynolds and his staff, and pelting up on the roads behind him and across the fields come the men of the First Corps of the Army of the Potomac. And you can just begin to imagine the relief John Buford must have felt at that moment, watching Reynolds arrive and get into position to give the surprise of their lives to the oncoming Confederate infantry.
Now, you're right about Reynolds. Reynolds, of course, is killed during the fighting, but he writes a last letter to Meade. What does he say to Meade in that letter?
It's almost an apology. He says to Meade, I know that your intention was to fight further back at Pipe Creek, but since I haven't had a direct order from you yet, I've taken my own counsel and initiative and moved up to Gettysburg. And if you'd like me to fall back, well, send me an explicit order. Well, yes, he's half apologizing. He's also half saying, I think that we need to do this. And he doesn't quite come to the point of saying to George Meade, please get moving and come up to my support, because Meade is down in Maryland at this point at Taneytown. Reynolds doesn't exactly say, get with the program, but it's fairly strongly implied. Within a few minutes of arriving on the scene there at Seminary Ridge, Reynolds is dead, shot by a Confederate skirmisher as he pushes his men forward to McPherson's Ridge, and that's where the opening encounter of the battle takes place. I mean, not just the cavalry pickets, I mean the real fighting in earnest.
How long does it take Meade to abandon his preference for a defensive position at Pipe Creek and commit himself to the Battle of Gettysburg?
Several hours, because communication, of course, is anything but swift at this point. And Meade is dependent on reports that would be brought to him and Taneytown by courier from Reynolds. Meade is uncertain what to do for several hours. In fact, at one point, he actually deputizes one of his other corps commanders, the commander of the Second Corps, Winfield Scott Hancock, and sends him up to Gettysburg to get some sense of what's going on. By the time Hancock gets there, Reynolds is gone, Reynolds is dead, the fighting has moved into a whole different stage. But Hancock's basic advice is, I think we need to fight here. Curiously, Meade had actually finally come to that conclusion himself and had begun to direct the other infantry corps of the Army of the Potomac to make their concentration at Gettysburg. So there's a process of Meade waiting to hear, but finally waiting to a point when, even if he hasn't heard, all right, he's going to assume that the Army of the Potomac has been committed and that he now needs to push the rest of the army up to Gettysburg. And that's what he orders.
So the first day, this battle results in some not good situation for the Union troops by the end of the day. However, they still maintain some positions that are useful. As when Meade comes up, what does he find?
He finds that Reynolds' 3 corps, the 1st Corps, the 11th Corps, 3rd Corps hasn't quite arrived at Gettysburg yet, hasn't quite made it up there by the time Meade gets there. Although its commanding officer, Daniel Sickles, is actually on site when Meade arrives. There is a 12th Corps under Henry Warner Slocum at Gettysburg, but Slocum had come up on his own initiative from 2 taverns. Meade arrives there, and what he sees is a Union force which has been pretty well hammered in its fighting on the first day. Reynolds lays out the basic position for the 1st Corps at the opening of the battle. But then he is killed and command falls to his subordinate, Abner Doubleday. By that point, yet another infantry corps, the 11th Corps, has come up. This is Otis Howard's 11th Corps, and Otis Howard basically has rank here. Howard has to decide, should I disengage? Should we fall back? Was this a mistake on Reynolds' part? Howard decides no, we need to fight here. Howard pushes his 11th Corps out north of the town, and he's hoping that the 3rd Corps and the 12th Corps are going to come to his rescue. They don't, at least not at that moment. When Robert E. Lee arrives on the scene at Gettysburg around 2 o'clock, he begins to take charge of what's happening there, and Lee coordinates Confederate attacks on the north side of the town and the west side of the town that just overwhelm the Union defenders. And the 1st Corps and the 11th Corps wind up fleeing in near disarray through the town of Gettysburg. And fleeing through the town doesn't help their disorganization one little bit. The wonder is that the wreckage of the 1st Corps and the 11th Corps didn't just keep on going southwards, out of the town, up over Cemetery Hill, so-called because that's where the town cemetery was, and keep on going further down into Maryland. And principally the reason it doesn't is because Oliver Otis Howard rallies them there on Cemetery Hill. And he's able to establish some provisional defensive lines. Hancock comes up at this point. Hancock agrees, all right, we should fight here. Slocum arrives around 6 p.m. and takes a position on the other side from Cemetery Hill, along Culp's Hill. But ultimately, the chief reason why the Union Army is able to rescue itself, get its second wind, and stop on Cemetery Hill and hold that ground is because the Confederates were exhausted. Lee's Confederates had been marching and fighting all day. By 6 o'clock, by 7 o'clock on an overcast day, the light is fading. Lee's army has been disorganized itself by pursuing the Federal Army through Gettysburg. Finally, Lee basically says, we're not going to do anything more this evening. If you think it's practicable, take some action, but if you don't, that's all right. We'll finish this job tomorrow. Big mistake.
Well, as this fight is unfolding, there are civilians still in Gettysburg. Many of them go into hiding in their own basements. What do they write about their experiences?
Oh, yes. Probably about half the civilian population of Gettysburg, which in those days was about 2,500 people. Half of that left. The black population of Gettysburg, they cleared out. They were not waiting around for the Confederates to show up, and with good reason. But many others left as well. The cashier of the local bank scoops up all the bank's reserve currency, gets on the train, and beats it eastward. He's not going to stick around to be robbed by the Confederates. And other storekeepers decide that prudence is the better part of valor, and they leave. What's surprising is how many civilians did stay in Gettysburg. And this is largely because there was an an almost unwritten rule that a house which was occupied was not going to be ransacked by Confederate troops, whereas a house that was empty, that had been abandoned by someone fleeing toward Philadelphia or Lancaster, that would be fair game. So many Gettysburg civilians stay in their houses and stay in their basements, not necessarily because they're models of physical courage. It's because there's a sort of loose understanding that if they stay in place in their house and somehow manage to survive, then the Confederates will not molest them there, will not ransack their houses. So you have lots of families which are clustered in these basements and are trying their very best to stay as much out of danger as they can, but yet at the same time to make it clear to the Confederates, these are our homes, we're civilians, and you should not be transgressing.
Now, we won't have enough time to go into great detail about the second and the third day, but I do want to touch on a few key things that happened during that period. One was a council of war after the second day's fighting that Meade held. Why was that important, and how did that lead to conflicts over the interpretation of the battle?
Because the second day's battle was almost as disastrous for the Army of the Potomac as the first day's battle. The first day's battle drained the blood out of the 1st and the 11th Corps. The second day's battle did pretty much the same thing to the 3rd Corps and the 5th Corps. And in truth, Lee's army came within a dime of breaking entirely through Meade's lines and forcing him to abandon Gettysburg. By the time we get to the late evening of July 2nd, when the last scattershot firing has died down, Meade is looking at this and realizing that the only really effective fighting force he's got left is 2 divisions of the 2nd Corps. Is that going to hold off Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia? Meade is not entirely sure of this. So Meade does something that was considered to be unprecedented. He called a council of war of his corps commanders, and they come together and they meet at Meade's temporary headquarters at the widow Lester's little cottage. And he puts the question to them, what should we do? And they go round, starting with the most junior and working up to the most senior of the officers. And one by one, they say, no, we need to fight. No, we need to stay. And finally, at the end, Winfield Scott Hancock sums it all up, and he says, this army has had enough retreating. We must stay and fight. At that point, Meade ponders it and says, all right, then that's what we'll do. We'll stay here. But he was reported by Abner Doubleday to have made this side comment. Nevertheless, gentlemen, Gettysburg is no place to fight a battle. Doubleday did have some scores he was trying to settle with Meade, so you have to take some of that with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, the very act of calling a council of war suggested to many people that Meade was looking for a rationale, maybe an excuse for a retreat. And when his corps commanders surprise him by stubbornly saying, no, we've got to fight here, he says, all right, well, that's what we're going to do then. And so the third day, the key of the Battle of Gettysburg, is going to dawn on an army that is not sure that it's going to survive another 24 hours of pounding.
Now, on the Confederate side, at the end of the second day, events would unfold that later would lead to continuing discussions and disagreements between Longstreet and Lee over some of the decisions that were made.
Longstreet, in the years after the war, insisted that he had advised Lee that launching these attacks on July 1st and July 2nd against the Union Army was not getting anywhere. What the Army of Northern Virginia needed to do was to slide around the left flank of the Union Army and force the Union Army to abandon Gettysburg. And the response that Lee seems to have given to Longstreet was, no, the enemy is there, we're going to fight him. What Lee has, as he is ace up the sleeve, is an entirely fresh and uncommitted division, the Division of Virginians, 3 brigades of Virginians under George Pickett. And Lee is going to throw them right at the nape of the neck of the Union line, just behind Cemetery Hill, in what today we call the Angle. Longstreet didn't even think that attack was a good idea. After the war, Longstreet insisted that he had said to Lee, Pickett's division has got about 15,000 men. No 15,000 men could take that position. Lee disagrees. He orders the attack, and Longstreet, again, by his own account, almost up to the last minute, is hesitant. But then he allows it to go forward, and that is what becomes Pickett's charge. Now, can we put total faith in Longstreet's recollections? I'm a little reluctant to do that. It's not because I'm hostile to the reputation and career of James Longstreet. I'm not a Longstreet hater. There are some. But at the same time, Longstreet was very effective as a corps commander. He did not demonstrate that he was of greater effect at any other command level, higher than that. And I'm not sure that what we read in a lot of Longstreet's post-war memoirs is a completely precise transcript of what transpired between he and Robert E. Lee on 3rd of July, 1863. So I entertain a mild degree of skepticism, hesitancy, let's say. I think that Longstreet, after the war, does what a lot of Confederate generals do. He's looking to explain away why they lost. It's a natural human impulse. But it also means that you have to be just a little cautious. The great attack goes forward, and as we know, it fails. It comes close, very close, but it fails. And afterwards, Lee meets the remnants of his battered Virginia division and says to them, this is all my fault. This is my fault. We must all rally. Almost all good men must rally. And then he realizes that he's used up his army and that he is going to have to retreat. And so organizes a great retreat back to the Potomac River with a view of crossing back into Virginia.
We've been speaking with Allen Guelzo. He is the author of the book Voices from Gettysburg. Allen, thanks for joining me.
Very good to be here, and thank you so much.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.